Let me warmly welcome you to today's event, and thank you for coming to our Cinema of Truth tonight. The National Transitional Justice Working Group has convened the Cinema of Truth tonight to commemorate the International Day of Truth for victims of gross human rights violations. As the National Transitional Justice Working Group, we commemorate this day and remember all the victims of gross human rights violations who are still fighting for the right to truth. The right to truth is important because the relatives of victims of summary executions, enforced disappearances, missing persons, abducted children, torture, require to know what happened to them. This annual observance pays tribute to the memory of Archbishop Romero, who was murdered on 24 March 1980. Archbishop Romero was actively engaged in denouncing violations of human rights of the most vulnerable individuals in El Salvador. As the National Transitional Justice Working Group, we observe the International Day of Truth, honor the memory of victims of gross and systematic human rights violations, and promote the importance of the right to truth and justice. We pay tribute to those who have devoted their lives to and lost their lives in the struggle to promote and protect human rights for all. We recognize in particular the important work of individuals such as Archbishop Romero of El Salvador, who was assassinated on 24 March 1980 after denouncing violations of human rights of the most vulnerable populations and defending the principles of protecting lives, promoting human dignity, and opposing all forms of violence, as well as those who have lost and whose whereabouts are unknown, such as Itai Zamara, Paul Chizuze, Josa Ngube, among others. We make special recognition of the work of our colleagues, Habakkuk Trust, in their recently launched book, Still Remembered, a compendium on missing persons in Zimbabwe, which was recently launched in Bulawayo. It is important that for us to remember the rights of the most vulnerable and the necessity of the need to ensure victims that there should be access to truth and justice. Without truth, justice, healing, reconciliation, and peace will always remain elusive. As Ban Ki-moon stated, the right to truth and justice are central to ending impunity for gross human rights violations. When we honor the right to truth as we are here today, it puts perpetrators on notice that violations cannot be hidden forever. Any person, regardless of their ethnicity, political affiliation, religious beliefs, gender or age, has the right to know who is responsible. Any family member whose family members have disappeared has a basic right to know their fate and their whereabouts.
I'll start off with introductions before we begin our panel discussion. My name is Tatinda Makanza. I'm with the National Transitional Justice Working Group Secretariat. To my immediate left is Shari Apple. She's the director of Ukutula Trust, which works with families that have of the disappeared in Matabeleland and is helping them in terms of resilience and finding closure. Next to Shari is Patson Zamara. Patson Zamara is the brother of Itai Zamara, who was disappeared in 2015. And to my far left is Rose Hanzi, who is the executive director of Zimbabwe Human Rights Lawyers. And she's also the Justice and Accountability Thematic Leader for the National Transitional Justice Working Group. I'll begin with Shari. And my question, Shari, is in your work with the victims, families of the deceased, and also relating it to the movie, how important is it to create safe spaces for victims to tell the truth?
Well, I think a simple answer to that is it's obviously very safe, and creating or arriving at truth, especially when there's still a huge amount of fear and stigma attached to certain things, that truth can take a long time to arrive at, and there can be many truths, and truth can change and become more embellished over time, and that safe place is absolutely essential. So it's part of being safe is also not being hurried, that it can take a long time for people to build the sort of relationships which allow them to come to the truth.
And can you tell us a little bit about your work and how your work promotes truth, and why you think that this is important for the families of victims that have deceased?
Well, I was originally a clinical psychologist, well, I am still, I guess, but we actually moved to forensic anthropology, which is exhumations, in the 1990s, and this was as pressure from families who said, our worst problem is the unburied dead, and the fact that we haven't been able to honor our dead and with the right traditional rituals and mourn them. And we began a process of training in expertise in exhumation and reburial, so that families could have back the truth of what happened to their dead. And we find that this is a very powerful way of arriving at truth. In fact, what I sometimes say is that exhumation does, in actuality, what clinical psychologists do, or therapy does metaphorically, which is to dig up the past, have a good look at it, see what it has to tell us about what happened, and then you can lay it to rest in an ordered way, and you can move on. And of course, that past is still there, but it doesn't weigh on you in this chaotic and hugely emotional way, which it does prior to being able to settle your dead and move away from ambiguous loss, what I would call ambiguous loss. And my experience in Matabeleland is that even when people know where their dead lie, they have ambiguous loss because they haven't been able to undertake umboyisto, they haven't been able to do the traditional rituals. So that is why exhumation is an extremely powerful way of restoring both truth and healing to families and communities.
Okay, thank you. Another question I have is, does truth lead to healing alone? When victims have access to the truth, does that promote healing and reconciliation?
I think healing is a very complicated concept. I don't think it's simple. I think many people never arrive at it. The same with reconciliation. But I do think that truth is nearly always important to people. There are some who just say, I don't even want to go back there. And then one must respect that. But I think that for all those who want truth, it is an important part in healing, but I wouldn't say it's enough. And I don't know that healing is something that we have to thrust upon people. I think if people choose to remain unreconciled in different ways to their past, then that can also be a choice, and it can be an activist choice. I think healing is not a simple thing, and certainly truth is important, but probably not enough.
Thank you. Next, I would like to ask Rose to tell us a little bit about the International Day of Truth, and also to speak about her work with human rights defenders as well as victims, and why this is important in terms of justice and accountability.
Thank you. I think it was very relevant for us to watch the movie that we just watched, particularly during this week, is the UN declared that the 24th of March is the International Day of Truth. given the events that have occurred around the world, particularly issues of crimes against humanity, genocide, and the other heinous offenses that have occurred. I'm just going to highlight, just briefly, in terms of the work that the lawyers have been doing over the years, trying to promote issues of healing, truth, and justice for victims of human rights violations. And for Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights and other organizations, I'll go back just before the turn of the millennium to the late 90s, when Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights and the Legal Resources Foundation filed a case where we were trying to compel the release of a report that had been done by one of the commissions of inquiry around the events that occurred in Matabeleland in the 80s. And I think a few people in the room may not have been born then, but they know about it. This case was filed at the Supreme Court then, sitting as the Constitutional Court, where we were trying to compel the then president to release the report with the findings of the Commission of Inquiry around the events that occurred, that are commonly referred to as Kukurahundi. And unfortunately, the case was dismissed because of national security issues. I think the judgment came out early 2000s. I think it was 2002. But it was one of the first attempts for us to try and see if we could get some justice and at least the truth to come out for the victims and survivors who had been very unfortunate during the occurrences in the 80s. And more recently, what we've also done was to take a case to the High Court in Masvingo to seek interpretation of the provisions in the Constitution. If you look at the Constitution that we have now, it establishes a number of Chapter 12 institutions, and one of them is the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, which is quite critical in terms of providing another avenue for victims and survivors to get some truth, justice, and healing if it's able to operate effectively and efficiently, and also with a victim-centered approach. So our main argument was for us to get some clarity in terms of when the 10 years that the Commission should be existing for started and when it should be ending. Because for us, we were arguing that the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission has not really been operational from 2013 when the Constitution came into force. And it will not do any justice to anyone who would want to interact with that National Peace and Reconciliation Commission for them to insist that the term of office for the commissioners and the commission ends in 2023. So we did manage to get a favorable judgment that the courts deemed the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission to have started operating in 2018 when the law, the enabling law for the Commission, National Peace and Reconciliation Commission was put into force. That was in January 2018. So we hope that going ahead for the victims and survivors and anyone who would want to interact with the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, they'll be able to do so without any jurisdiction challenges around when the term of office for the Commission ends. But as an organization, outside some of these efforts that we've taken at the national level, we've also been over the years trying to assist victims of human rights violations, their families and survivors in different ways. Some of the cases that we've taken up have been in an attempt to prevent recurrence of some of the violations that we continue to see, particularly violations around the use of torture, cruel and inhuman degrading treatment by particularly the police and also the members of the military. And we've managed to file a number of anti-impunity claims against them, where we'll be claiming damages for the victims. And this has also even included cases where victims are not necessarily tortured, but they lose property which is destroyed in forced evictions. And for some who have been following the events over the last few years, you recall the cases around the Manzo farm area in Mazowe, where some of the former farm workers were being evicted, property destroyed. We did manage to get some damages paid by the police on their behalf. And this is one way that we've been working as Zimbabwe lawyers to try and see if we can get some form of justice. Because as you can see from the movie, and for those who have been following events in Zimbabwe, it can take a very long time for victims to get justice, and some can actually get to pass away without necessarily getting justice.
How can the MPRC or lawyers, human rights defenders, ensure that there's witness protection mechanisms so that victims are able to access truth?
Thank you. I just want to maybe just clarify that when it comes to witness protection, I think it's supposed to be a multi-stakeholder effort, and not just the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission or the lawyers. But we also need the support from other institutions that are supposed to be protecting people from crimes or from harm, such as the law enforcement agents, particularly the Zimbabwe Republic Police, which is now supposed to be the police service for the country. So it has to be a multi-stakeholder effort. And we do hope that the Commission will put in place robust witness protection mechanisms, and also the police will inculcate a culture of human rights within the police service, and also do further reforms and training to ensure that they can be able to offer that protection. The power and capacity of lawyers is very limited. Lawyers can only ensure that if there are issues of witness protection, they raise them with the relevant institutions, and where they are not addressed, they can then even approach the courts to see if anything can be done to enforce that. But lawyers have very limited powers, and they can also even get attacked. I think in the past we have seen lawyers getting arrested, lawyers getting assaulted, lawyers receiving death threats, and I think some of the lawyers in the room, particularly the chairperson, has been a victim of that. So lawyers are not immune, and we do not have those powers beyond what we can do using the legal processes, but we expect to work with other stakeholders.
And you also mentioned that in some cases it takes very long. The justice system in Zimbabwe takes very long. So how can we as stakeholders or as a country maintain momentum while we are pursuing justice and accountability, and also the right to truth?
Thank you, Tatenda. I think what we are doing at the moment is part of the efforts to maintain that momentum in terms of just creating platforms for dialogue and hoping that we'll get more participation by all the stakeholders going ahead. But I think we also need to create greater awareness, particularly amongst some of the victims and survivors, in terms of some of the challenges and hurdles that they may face when they're going through the justice system, but also just to ensure that there is also the support from the communities in cases where we actually have brave victims who are willing to go through the processes. But I think maintaining the platforms where there can be dialogue, discussion, and also just raising the political costs by continuing to do advocacy around pushing for, speedy determination of cases, reform of the system, whether it's going to be the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, whatever procedures or processes they put in place. I think we need to continue to play the watchdog role, whether it's civil society and as communities, to continue to push them at least to ensure that at least victims are able to get access to justice within a reasonable time.
For you, Patson, I would like to ask, why is it important for you and your family to know the truth about what happened to Itai?
Thank you, Tatena. See, when we're dealing with issues such as these ones, it's almost hard for me or for some of us not to be engulfed under a multitude of emotions, because we are directly affected and involved in the processes. Having said that, when you're talking about truth, I think we need to debunk the twofold function of truth from my standpoint. Number one, truth brings healing. And then number two, truth brings reconciliation. And there is a popular scripture in the Bible, it should be John 8:32. It says, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." Now, in our case, as regards Itai's issue, we find ourselves in a very precarious position because we've not really managed to find the truth. We've not really managed to unpack the truth behind what really transpired to Itai Dzamara. We know in part and we speak in part, but as far as the subtotality of what really transpired to Itai Dzamara, we do not know. And that really leaves us in a precarious position as a family. And I'm sure this speaks to a broader issue to a nation. And what is that issue? The issue has everything to do with, I think one of the speakers in the documentary said that when you are abused or when you're fighting against something, it's so easy for you to become the same thing you're fighting. And so I think that's where we find ourselves as a nation. And the manifestation of that is apparent for all to see. We've witnessed what has been transpiring since January. We've witnessed what has transpired after the election last year in August. And I think all that is just a manifestation of a deeply entrenched problem. And what is that problem? I think that problem has everything to do with unaddressed issues and unspoken truths regarding what has been meted out against the citizens by the authorities that be. And so until and unless we invoke a truly meaningful and holistic process towards truth, which will then culminate in healing and reconciliation, every other effort to try and move Zimbabwe forward is not going to pay any dividend. And in my view, it is actually my humble submission that Zimbabwe's most urgent need is not political reformation or economic transformation. Zimbabwe's most urgent need is actually the recalibration or the re-engineering of our social fabric. And why do I say that? I say that because as a nation, we've gone through several episodes of hate. We've gone through several episodes of atrocities meted out against the citizens by the authorities. And so our history is replete with such issues and cases. Until and unless that is addressed, until and unless that is attended to as a matter of urgency, whatever we try to do in the political dimension or even in the economic dimension is not going to pay dividend for as long as we do not attend to the issue of truth, which will ultimately culminate in healing and, of course, reconciliation.
And citizens have not really been speaking with one voice or supporting each other on certain issues where you would expect citizens or communities to be speaking with one voice, particularly to hold those accountable for human rights violations. And going ahead for us to get a collective truth, I think we need to work across generations. What we have seen is most people would prefer to champion their own issues to get the truth. And there are different episodes of human rights violations that have occurred in Zimbabwe, going as far back as before independence, during independence, after independence, 2000, 2008, and 2013. There are different episodes. So how do we catalyze the voices of all the community members? How do we increase awareness in terms of how they can support each other, for people to be able to speak with one voice and ensure that they hold institutions such as the NPRC, National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, accountable for them to deliver on their mandate? I think that's the work that civil society has to start looking at more strategically now, especially given the fact that we still have about 9 years to go with this commission, and even beyond the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, as Patson was saying, we probably may not get what we want with the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, but we've seen in other countries, particularly in Latin America, where violations that have occurred 30 years before that could not be addressed have suddenly been opened up for some justice through efforts taken at the courts or at other level. Thank you.
I'd also like to echo what Rose said, that especially in light of the documentary that we saw, that there's so much power in citizens that we can't underestimate, even if we don't have a leadership that is spearheading the truth-telling process as much as we would want them to, or how would we envision them to. I think maybe we can just wrap up the panel with just a few closing remarks on what we envision the MPRC to, what our expectations are for the MPRC, and as we search for truth as well, how can we make sure that we don't open up old wounds or hit or disturb trauma that's unseen?
The issue of old wounds, not opening up old wounds, we hear it all the time in Matabeleland. And I think that, you know, perhaps for some victims that's true, but I think it has to be an individual choice, and that there are many thousands of people through all the eras of violence who actually are still waiting for an opportunity to be heard and for their truth to be out in the public domain. And I wouldn't, you know, the TRC had this quote, healing, you know, revealing is healing. I wouldn't say it's as simple as that, but I do think, as we've already said, it can be part of partially healing. In terms of the MPRC and what we expect of it, I think the thing is that perhaps it's something that we can still form and push. I mean, what you saw with the, you know, with this tribunal, for example, is all sorts of things happening opportunistically and falling in place. You have individuals, you know, producing reports on rape, and then somebody else reading it, and then eventually some witness coming forward, and things resonating and falling in place in a sort of way that we can't sit here and predict. And so you can have institutions which are limited in who's in them, who are limited in their resources, but you can still force that to become a more useful space and to make it work for you in certain ways and for certain things to happen. You know, at the best, at the most optimistic, you know, perhaps that's what I would say about the NPRC.
Well, I think I've probably spoken to that already, but I'll just probably just reiterate my reservation. I have strong reservations, really, as far as the commission is concerned, and whether it will attain the set targets and goals. However, I do understand and I know that it's a step in the right direction. But I think the problems or the issues are deeply entrenched. They require the willingness of the leadership, the willingness of the powers that be to set the tone and to blaze a trail, so that, you know, these issues are dealt with sincerely and holistically. Because what we're going to see is this: there's just going to be a semblance of movement. I'll just give as an example. We know that our VP has been the army commander for a long time. So if anything happened under his command, I think it's really far-fetched, especially knowing them. It's really far-fetched for us to think and expect that if there's anything implicating him, it's going to sail through and it's going to be dealt with in a holistic manner. I don't see that happening. Again, I think it leaves us at a position where we need to ask ourselves what we therefore need to do. And I'm sure we all know what we need to do, because chances are very high that the perpetrator cannot be the custodian or cannot be the overseer of justice. And so there's got to be some shifts and changes which are critical if we are to realize the set targets of this commission, and just from a panoramic standpoint.
I'll just speak on the expectations of the NPRC, because I think Shelley has spoken as a clinical psychologist on opening up old wounds. Just to say, we would expect at the minimum, other than issues of them being independent, which is questionable, and having adequate resources, that they set up a robust witness protection mechanism for witnesses to be able to come forward and give their testimonies freely and feel that they are protected, but also for them to adopt what we call a victim-centered approach, where the needs of the victims actually shape their processes and procedures for them to feel confident to interact with the Commission. And it's something that I think we are yet to see, whether they'll be able to set that up. And I think that will be a deal breaker if those mechanisms or processes are not set up to the satisfaction of victims and witnesses, then they may not be able to achieve what they're supposed to be achieving. Thank you.
Thank you. I think a lot of important points were raised, such as individual truth, working with communities, bringing in culture, as well as the expectations from the MPRC. Unfortunately, we're running behind time, so we'll close the panel now. So I'd like to invite you to thank our panelists. We'll be able to ask them further questions.
Okay, my name is Tafaza Mopururira. I'm a filmmaker. My question is there a way, or if there is anyone from the UN that I can get funding to do documentaries like this? And then the second question is going to the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission. As you know that Zendele from Bulawayo was arrested for holding an empty canister of tear gas. How best can I be secure when I do films like this? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Salwanani, my name is Mandate. So I think for me, one is an observation and one is a question. First of all, I think what Sherry said is very important about the people of Matabeleland. I think as a young person who's lived her whole life being told this happened and nothing's been done about it, or hearing just the stories of what happened to people, and the fact that nothing is being done. And I think for me, like what that woman said in the documentary, that sometimes all that people need is a sorry. I think a sorry comes in to acknowledge that what you experience actually happened. Because as it stands right now, there is an effort to make it look like nothing happened in Matabeleland, or rather, let's just move on. We need to build a Zimbabwe. You can't build when I'm broken. So I think that's the most important thing. Then the second thing for me is a concern to say the NPRC may not work or doesn't have the capacity with all those things that we feel are a weakness. What alternative do we have? What alternative are we putting on the table? Because I think it's not enough to say it's not going to work in this way. If it's not working, what are we putting forward to do? Let's go for it. Let's do it. Because at the end of the day, someone's just going to come back and say, we put forward a commission. And they did. They're going to write a report. There's nothing that you can do about it. But if you're able to provide an alternative and push for it, I think maybe you can get us the results we're looking for. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm John, I'm a Jesuit. My question is on the need for apology versus justice. With much demand for apology, don't we risk deflating the whole process of justice? What do we want to attain at the end of the whole process of justice? Do we want a sorry? I ask this because of what I've seen in many countries when it comes to campaigning. It's very easy to tell people I'm sorry and they feel everything has been done. But then with justice and the whole judicial process, there should be a goal that we are looking for. You know, that should be beyond just a mere sorry. So maybe a comment on the whole judicial process or the the end of justice and the whole demand for apology. Thank you.
Blessing is my name. I just wanted to ask the panelists to just give us some brief remarks about their view around the increasing calls for national dialogue vis-a-vis the issues of truth that we've just been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll start off to respond to the filmmaker who was just inquiring on how he can be secure when he's doing his work. Unfortunately, I will not be able to provide you with a manual to maybe let you know how you can best be secure. when you're doing your work, because what we have seen over the last few years has been almost everything has been criminalized, particularly if you're a human rights defender and you're working to maybe expose injustices within communities or that have been perpetrated by state actors. So the best information that we can provide for you to be more secure is how you can then get in touch with service providers who can then assist you when you get targeted by the state. We have seen people who have been arrested for just walking in the streets and they've been accused of loitering, and yet someone is just going about their business in the city center. So it's very difficult for us to be able to provide you with clear information on how best you can be secure. But I think there are also other organizations that are also offering security tips in terms of trainings for human rights defenders that you can also maybe explore to see whether that will be something that will do for the work that you're doing around documentation, which is very critical in terms of transitional justice efforts in the country. And maybe just to comment briefly on the issues around the apology and justice and recurrence of violations, which was coming out. I think what we need to agree on is when it comes to addressing human rights violations that have occurred in a context where we need to deal with them in a transitional justice process, is the victim-centered approach. It really depends on what the victims want or survivors. Some of the victims or survivors will just want an apology. For them, that is enough. And then there are others who would want to go further to then get justice, and with justice they can get compensation, or they can get punishment of the perpetrator, or they can get some other form of justice that they feel satisfies them. So it's very difficult for us to say justice or an apology, which one works, because it really depends on what the victim or the survivor prefers. And of course, with justice, there can be other benefits. They may not be able to restore the victim or survivor to the place they should have been if the violation had not occurred, but there will be some level of satisfaction. And for some, an apology will be satisfactory, or just the truth, knowing the truth, even without an apology, would actually be acceptable to them and should actually be a way to facilitate healing going forward. Thank you.
I'll just respond to a few things. Yes, national dialogue was asked by someone. I'm sort of starting at the end first. And again, I mean, I think that's a very, very important issue at this stage, because it's hard to see sometimes light in the end of the tunnel right now in Zimbabwe, with the economy the way it is, employment the way it is, you know, the recent events which have happened here. And I think the National Transitional Justice Working Group has produced this little book here called The Code of Inclusion, which I think is looking partially at that issue, so people can look at that. And I think this is really, really important, that, you know, who mandates something? Where does dialogue take place? Who is included? Who gives those people a mandate to be included? I mean, all of these things are highly emotive and very important, and it has to be as broad and as inclusive as possible. And before one even starts having meetings, there ought to be a lot of discussion, you know, and you know, what is it that you think this dialogue should head towards? You know, what's your vision at the end of it? You know, so I think national dialogue is very important. I don't think any very important national dialogue has yet happened. So, you know, because of who's mandating it, who's being included, who's not being included. So I think it's something that all of us in Zimbabwe should be putting a lot of thought and energy into. And in terms of what can we do with the MPRC, again, it just comes back to this. I mean, certainly in Matabeleland, levels of fear of talking about Gakrohundi are still so high. I think it's hard for people to understand that in other parts of the country, because they say it was so long ago now, it was more than 30 years ago. But the state reaction, every time anyone, I mean, I don't know how many of you have been following what's been happening at Balagwi camp, for example, which was the big torture and murder center from 1984, and how people just keep knocking down memorials. You know, we have a mass grave there where some people were reburied, and, you know, recently the words mass grave were cemented over, as if that can change the reality of what's in the grave. So there are these very visceral, competitive things happening around memory in Matabeleland right now, which at one level I find quite exciting and interesting, because at least it's something. At least it's people trying to be allowed to memorialize and remember, and then not being allowed to, and then trying to again. So, I would hope that something like the NPRC can at least do something about fear and acknowledgement that all areas of history have a right to be talked about and have a right to be memorialized. Because something which I think many people don't realize, there's not a single memorial to people who died at the hands of 5th Brigade. Not one single memorial, to many, many thousands of people who died. And it's a long time ago now. So just to even be safe to remember is something which needs to happen.
Well, without sounding political, I'll answer the question the other lady at the back asked. I think, just to paraphrase, she asked, if the NPRC fails, then what? Well, one man once intoned that problems are not solved at the same level they were created. And I think that says it. Problems are never solved at the same level they were created. In other words, the problem creator cannot be expected really to be the problem solver. And so whether we like it or not, I know probably this sounds a bit political, but that's the truth. Whether we like it or not, expecting meaningful and drastic changes we are looking for through these processes from the same creators of the problems, I think it's not only ridiculous, I think we have to just come to terms with the fact that it's actually far-fetched, unless something really outrageously radical happens, which I do not see happening anyway. And so I think we need to come to terms with that fact, and as the citizens, we need to know what to do. Even when it comes to elections, we need to know what to do, because expecting problems which were created by those creators to be solved by them, I don't think it works. It's simple logic. That's my view.
Okay. Right, panelists, thank you very much. I intend that these conversations continue over refreshments. We have refreshments that are out there. So at this particular point in time, if you will allow me to release our chair and our panelists, thank you very much. Please help me give them a warm round of applause.
I have been asked by the National Transitional Justice Working Group and the NGO Forum to offer my closing remarks on their behalf. We thank you for having come. We also thank you for sharing the pain that we have seen. And finally, there's one thing that we must take away from those kinds of things. This is our country, and it's the only country that we have. No one owns it better than us. And if we take that away with us, we'll be able to mobilize ourselves, organize ourselves, and reject impunity and deny the right of other people to inflict pain on us. Thank you very much for coming.